The baby wouldn't stop crying. Not for anything Coulter tried. For 3 solid weeks ever since Leia died, the screaming had been the only sound in the house. It started before the sun bled over the Wyoming plains, and it carried on long after the last light had faded, a thin, raw, piercing sound that scraped away at the silence of the ranch. He'd rocked the baby, Maddie, until his arms felt like they were on fire. He'd sung every broken lullaby his wife used to whisper into the dark. He'd even held her up to the wind, a desperate prayer that the wild, open air might somehow soothe her. Nothing worked. It was like a part of that tiny infant knew her mother was never coming back, and she was screaming into the void she'd left behind. The wailing echoed in the empty corners of the house. It burrowed into the timber frames, settled deep in the floorboards, and worked its way right into Coulter's bones until he thought he was losing his mind. He knew he was. His beard was a matted mess. His boots were stained with sour milk. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, hadn't shaved, hadn't sat down for a real meal since the funeral. His entire world had shrunk to this: a squirming, red-faced, inconsolable infant who only found peace when she finally passed out from sheer exhaustion. Sometimes he wished he could do the same. It was on a morning just like that, with his shirt half-buttoned and Maddie's wails rising from her cradle like a storm, that Coulter heard the knock. He stumbled to the door, expecting a neighbor with a casserole and pity in their eyes. He swung it open, and the world tilted on its axis. The woman on his porch wasn't a stranger, not really. For a long second he didn't recognize her. She was different now, harder. Her dark hair was pinned up tight instead of braided loose like it used to be. Her eyes were sharper, her mouth a thinner line, as if life had pressed down on her so hard it had squeezed all the softness out. But the longer he stared, the more the familiarity rose up, unshakable and deeply unwelcome. Those were Leia's cheekbones. That was Leia's stubborn jawline. And then it hit him like a physical blow. Claire, he breathed, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. What in the hell are you doing here? She didn't flinch. Her coat was caked in trail dust, and her boots were thick with dried mud, but her back was ramrod straight. She looked like she could stand there for a week without moving. "You sent for a nanny," she said, her voice flat. "So I came." Coulter's mind reeled. "I didn't send for you. You put an ad in the Laramie paper," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "You didn't use your name. I answered." He stared at her, disbelief warring with a cold dread that was starting to creep up his spine. "You think this is a good idea?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't answer. Her eyes flickered past him, toward the sound of the baby's crying, which was rising again in a furious, panicked crescendo. "She sounds just like Leia did when she had colic," Claire said, her voice softer now. "That was years ago," he managed to say. "I remember." And that was the worst part of it. He knew she did. She remembered everything. Coulter stepped aside, not because he wanted to, but because Maddie's crying had turned into a desperate, hitched roar that tore at his soul. Claire brushed past him without a word, a gust of clean, cold air in the stale house. She didn't need to ask where to go. She just followed the sound of the wailing down the hall. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom like a ghost, watching. Claire walked to the cradle. She reached down and lifted Maddie into her arms. She didn't coo. She didn't rock her. She didn't sing. She just held her, one hand smoothing over the baby's tiny spine in slow, sure, confident circles. And within 30 seconds, the crying stopped. Just stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, it felt louder than the screaming had. Coulter felt a tight knot in his chest, one that had been there for weeks, finally loosen. And he hated it. He hated her for it. He found his voice, a raw whisper. "Why now, Claire? After all this time, why now?" Claire looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. She was still holding Maddie, who was now nestled against her, quiet and calm. "Because you're alone," she said simply, "and she shouldn't be." "She has me," he shot back, the words defensive and weak even to his own ears. Claire didn't argue. She just turned her attention back to the baby, whispering something so quiet that Coulter couldn't make it out. He stood there, a stranger in his own home, watching the sister of his dead wife soothe his child with an ease he couldn't comprehend. And he had a terrible sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, the kind that rattled the window panes and beat against the roof like a drum. Thunder shook the old ranch house, but inside, for the first time in weeks, there was a fragile peace. Claire moved around his kitchen like she belonged there, and in a way, she once had. Leah had been the middle sister, Claire the oldest. When their mother ran off, it was Claire who'd stepped in, raising Leah herself. She'd spent summers on this very ranch, mending fences, tending horses, and trying to keep Leah out of the trouble she always seemed to find. She had been family. And then, 5 years ago, she had vanished. Claire broke eggs into a skillet, her movements efficient and sure, ignoring the clap of thunder outside. "Maddie's sleeping," she said, not looking at him. "First real sleep she's had all day. She was overtired. You've been overstimulating her." The criticism, gentle as it was, still stung. "I'm doing the best I can," he said, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed over his chest. "I didn't say you weren't." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "You disappeared after the funeral," he said finally, unable to hold it in any longer. She stopped what she was doing, her back still to him. "I needed space." "For 5 years?" he pressed. "You needed 5 years of space?" She turned then, her expression unreadable. "I couldn't be near you, Coulter. Not after. Not after what?" She shook her head, turning back to the stove. She flipped the eggs onto a plate and set it on the table. She didn't sit. She just stood there, watching him. "It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," he insisted. Her gaze was intense, searching. "Do you really want me here, Coulter?" He didn't answer her directly. He couldn't. The truth was too complicated, a tangled mess of grief and guilt and something else, something he hadn't dared to name in years. Instead, he walked to the table, sat down, and picked up a fork. It was answer enough, for now. The next morning, Claire came down from the attic, carrying a small, dusty wooden box. "I found these in Leah's trunk," she said, her voice quiet. She set the box on the kitchen table, letters, journals, pictures of the 3 of us. Coulter froze. The box might as well have been a coiled rattlesnake. He didn't want to see what was inside. He didn't want the weight of Leah's words, the ghost of her smile, the memory of her laughter. It was too soon. It would always be too soon. "She never said anything," Claire added softly, her eyes full of a sorrow that mirrored his own. "But I think she knew. I think she knew she was sick long before anyone else did. I think she left these for you." He couldn't bring himself to touch it, but Claire opened it anyway. Her fingers, steady and sure, pulled out an old photograph. The 3 sisters, standing in a field of wildflowers. Leah in the middle, vibrant and laughing, her arms slung around Claire and their younger sister. "She was happy here," Claire whispered, a catch in her voice. "Even when she wasn't." The grief, which had been a dull ache, sharpened again into a blade. "She was always better when you were around," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. Claire looked up, her eyes locking with his. "I loved her too, Coulter." And there it was again. That invisible current that pulled between them, a dangerous undertow of shared history and secrets. It was something neither of them had ever dared to name, not before the wedding, not after the funeral, and certainly not in the 5 years of suffocating silence that had followed. He couldn't stand it. "I've got fence to mend," he muttered, pushing back from the table and striding out of the house, away from the box, away from her, away from the memories that were threatening to drown him. He didn't look back, but he knew she was still there, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she wasn't going anywhere. By the 3rd day, the whispers started. This was a small community. News traveled on the wind. Neighbors who came by to offer condolences saw the strange woman moving about the ranch. They didn't recognize her from town. A few of the older folks remembered Leia having a sister, sure, but not this one. Not this woman with the hard eyes and the ramrod straight back. More than a few remembered the funeral, too. They remembered how that sister, Claire, had cried harder than anyone, her body racked with a grief that seemed too big for one person to hold. And they remembered how Coulter hadn't looked at her once, not a single glance, not even when she'd reached out and touched the pine casket, her hand trembling, as if it was the only thing holding her upright. The talk festered, growing like weeds in the cracks of the town's foundation. That night after dinner, Claire stood at the kitchen window, her arms folded across her chest as she stared out into the gathering dark. "She still has Leia's eyes," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But her mouth is all yours." Coulter poured himself a half glass of whiskey, the amber liquid a small comfort in his hand. "I know," he said. "I see Leia every time I look at her." "Me too," Claire whispered, and in the reflection on the dark glass, he saw her eyes shimmer with unshed tears. "I thought it would hurt more, seeing her face in the baby, but it doesn't, not in the way I expected." They stood in a heavy, loaded silence, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the mantel. "Why'd you really leave, Claire?" he asked, the question breaking the quiet. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Because I couldn't stay." "That's not an answer." "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "It is." He took a step closer, searching her face, trying to peel back the layers of time and pain to find the woman he used to know. "What happened between us?" he asked, his voice raw. "Back then, was any of that real?" She didn't blink. Her gaze held his, unwavering and intense. It was everything. The confession hung in the air between them, cracking the silence like a bolt of lightning. The world seemed to stop, the past rushing into the present, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought he might finally understand. And then, a sharp, commanding knock echoed from the front door. Coulter stiffened instantly. It was nearly midnight. No one came out this far, this late, unless they were carrying trouble in their pockets. His hand instinctively grazed the cool stock of the rifle he kept propped by the door frame. He moved slowly, deliberately, every nerve on high alert. He pulled the door open, just a crack. The man standing on his porch was soaked through with rain, his face drawn and pale in the flickering lantern light. His boots were coated in thick river mud. "Coulter Hart?" the man asked, his voice tired but firm. "That's me." "I've come about the woman," the man said, his eyes flicking past Coulter into the house. Just then, Claire stepped into view behind him. The man's eyes narrowed into slits. "You said your name was Claire," the man said, his voice laced with accusation. "But that ain't the name I know you by." Coulter turned slowly, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He looked at Claire, at her calm, unreadable face. "What's he talking about?" Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, dangerously quiet. "It's complicated." The man at the door shook his head, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Not that complicated," he said, pulling back his rain slicker to reveal the glint of a badge. "She's wanted in 3 counties, ma'am, and I'm here to bring her in." Coulter stood frozen, the cold wind whipping through the open door, chilling him to the core. His fingers hovered over the rifle, but he didn't grab it. Not yet. His world, already shattered by grief, had just been hit by a second cataclysm. Claire didn't move. She didn't look at the lawman on the porch or at Coulter. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point in the darkness. She simply stood there, shoulders back, spine straight, as if she had been expecting this exact moment her entire life. "I don't want any trouble here, Mr. Hart," the lawman said, his voice regaining its official tone. "I was told a woman fitting her description rode west from Laramie. Turns out she came straight to you." "What exactly is she wanted for?" Coulter asked, his own voice sounding foreign, like it was coming from a great distance. The lawman's eyes darted to Claire before answering. Fraud, evasion, a significant amount of thievery. Nothing bloody, he added quickly, but the law's the law. That's funny, Coulter muttered, a dark anger beginning to simmer beneath his shock. Because I don't recall putting out a call for a U.S. Marshal. I'm not here on official badge business, the man admitted, shifting his weight. This is a private interest. They're offering a substantial reward for her in Cheyenne. I'm just a rancher, same as you. But when that kind of money talks... She's not going anywhere, Coulter interrupted, his voice like iron. He shut the door with a hard, definitive thud, plunging the porch back into darkness and leaving them in a silence that was suddenly suffocating. He turned to face Claire, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Tell me that man is lying. Claire held his gaze, her expression unyielding. He's not. He waited. He waited for an explanation, an excuse, a plea, anything. But she offered nothing. She just stood there, bathed in the soft lantern light, radiating a kind of preternatural calm that unnerved him far more than panic ever could. You're not going to explain? He finally exploded, his voice rising without warning. You show up on my doorstep, you come into my house, you hold my daughter in your arms, my dead wife's daughter. And you thought eventually would be soon enough to tell me you're a wanted criminal? For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face, a flash of anger. I didn't come here to hide, she snapped. I came here because Maddie needed someone, because you needed someone. And you thought lying would help? I didn't lie. You gave a false name. I did not, she shot back, her voice ringing with a fierce conviction. My name is Claire. What that man said, that's only a part of the truth. Coulter raked a hand through his hair, his mind a chaotic whirl. He was trying to think, trying to hold on to the last fraying thread of order in his life. In the back room, Maddie had started crying again, a thin, fretful sound, as if she could feel the tension vibrating through the very walls of the house. I need the whole truth, Claire, he said, his voice dropping low, each word heavy with menace. Not pieces, not when it's convenient for you, all of it. Now. Claire moved away from him, walking to the hearth. She stood with her back to him, staring into the dying embers of the fire as if the answers were written in the flames. Do you remember Jed Hollis? She asked, her voice tight. Coulter's hands stilled. The name was poison in this part of the country. That snake who used to own the livestock company near Bitter Ridge, he said. He was bleeding ranchers dry for years. He was doing more than that, Claire said, turning to face him, her eyes burning with a cold fire he'd never seen before. He had a network of lies a mile long. He was forging loan papers, selling off cattle that weren't his, driving families into the ground. My friend Martha, her husband hanged himself in their barn because Hollis ruined them. He took everything they had. She took a shaky breath. So I went after him. I got a job in his office, I dug into his ledgers, I found the proof of everything he'd done, and I took what I could. I took back the money he'd stolen and I mailed it anonymously to the families he cheated. Coulter stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. So you stole from a thief? Yes, she said, without an ounce of shame. And when I was done, I burned his office to the ground. I made sure there was nothing left but ash. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the frantic beating of his own heart. The woman who had calmed his crying child was an avenging angel, a vigilante who had taken the law into her own hands. And that man outside, he said slowly, he's not a lawman, he's a bounty hunter. Claire nodded, her face looking older, wearier than it had just moments before. I've made my peace with the choices I made, Coulter, but I didn't expect my past to follow me here this fast. A long, tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of her confession. Outside, the storm raged, pushing tumbleweeds against the side of the house like old, forgotten regrets. We need to talk to that man again, Coulter said finally, his voice grim. before he rides off and tells half the territory you're holed up here." He strode to the door and flung it open. The bounty hunter was still there, leaning against a porch beam, his hat pulled low against the driving rain. "We're not trying to start a fight," Coulter said, his voice hard as stone. "But you come onto my land again without an invitation, and you'll meet the wrong end of this rifle." The man didn't flinch. "I ain't stepping inside," he replied, his arms crossed over his chest. "But I'll say my piece." Coulter nodded once. "Make it quick." "I don't know who she is to you," the man said, his gaze flicking to Claire, who now stood in the doorway beside Coulter. "But you need to understand something. If she stays here, you're not just inviting trouble. You're inviting a war. Hollis has folks everywhere still looking for payback, and he's not a man who forgives." "I'm not afraid of Jed Hollis," Claire said, her voice ringing with defiance. The bounty hunter let out a short, harsh laugh. "You should be. It ain't just about the money anymore. You didn't just burn his ledgers. You destroyed his entire operation. You humiliated him. He lost everything. And a man like that, he's vindictive." Coulter's eyes narrowed. "So you're not here for the bounty?" "No," the man admitted, shaking his head. "I came to warn you." "Then why the act?" Coulter demanded. "Why pretend to be a bounty hunter?" "Because it was the only way I knew to get your attention," the man said, his gaze earnest. "My brother was one of the men Hollis ruined. Your friend. She gave us our lives back. I owed her." He looked directly at Claire. "But you need to know. Hollis knows about you and Coulter. He knows you were close once. If he can't find you, he's smart enough to know where to look. He'll come after this ranch. He'll come after the baby." Then he nodded once, turned without another word, and vanished into the rain-swept darkness. The rest of the night passed in a taut, unbearable silence. Claire didn't even try to sleep. She sat in the old wooden rocker near Maddie's crib, her eyes trained on the blackness outside the window, as if expecting danger to materialize out of the shadows at any moment. Coulter didn't sleep either. He stayed in the kitchen, the shotgun resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the back door as if it had grown a heartbeat of its own. Morning came, but it brought no relief. Just a gray, oppressive sky and the lingering smell of rain and fear. Claire was the first to speak, her voice low and strained as she stood at the stove. "I should go." "No." The word was out of his mouth before he even thought about it. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "I don't want you to go," he said, the truth of the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "And if you leave now, they'll find you that much quicker, alone." She hesitated, her hand resting on the handle of the skillet. "So what's the plan, Coulter? I stay here and risk putting you and Maddie directly in the crosshairs?" "We're already in them," he said, his voice grim. "Hollis knows you're here. That man made sure of it. At least if you're here, we face whatever's coming together." Claire set down the spatula and leaned against the counter, her gaze never leaving his face. She was watching him, weighing him, searching for something in his eyes. "I didn't just come back for Maddie," she said finally, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the crackle of the fire. Coulter said nothing. He just waited. "I came back because I never stopped thinking about you," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I hated myself for it. I hated that I let myself, that I felt what I felt for you when you were with Laya, when you were married to my sister. But it never went away, no matter how far I ran." His hands curled into tight fists around his coffee mug, his knuckles turning white. "You think I didn't feel the same?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "You think I didn't see you every time I closed my eyes?" "I think you tried to bury it," she whispered. "Same as me." A long, ragged breath escaped him. It felt like he'd been holding it for 5 years. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I only know that I'm not the same girl who ran away from Laya's funeral. I've done things, Coulter. Things I can't take back." He walked toward her then, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the wooden floor. Each step seemed to close a 5-year gap between them. When he finally stood in front of her, so close he could see the flicker of fear and hope in her eyes, she didn't flinch. But she didn't move closer either. It was like watching two worlds collide, two souls drawn together by a force neither of them could control. "I see you," he said, his voice low and intense. "The you right now, and I still want you here." A tremor passed through her body. Her lips parted as if to speak, and then 3 gunshots shattered the morning calm. They came from a distance, sharp and clean and deadly. Claire and Coulter locked eyes, the confession, the hope, the fear, all of it vaporizing in an instant. Primal instinct took over. She raced for Maddie's crib. He spun around and grabbed the rifle from its place by the door. He looked out the window. On the far ridge, a dust cloud was rising against the gray sky. Riders, at least 4 of them. And they were coming fast. "Back door," Claire said, her voice all steel now. She was already moving, scooping up a swaddled Maddie from her crib. "We need to take the baby and run." Coulter hesitated, his hand tightening on the rifle. "This is my land! And it won't mean a thing if we're dead on it," she shot back, her eyes blazing. The riders were closing the distance with terrifying speed, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a lit fuse. Claire wrapped Maddie in another thick blanket and shoved the bundle into Coulter's arms. "You go," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Go out the back, follow the stream bed, and stay low. I'll stall them." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you. They're after me, Coulter, not you. This is my fight. I have to be the one to end this. It's the only way. Claire." She didn't let him finish. She grabbed the front of his shirt, pulled him close, and kissed him. It was a hard, fast, desperate kiss. A kiss that tasted of fear and gunpowder and 5 years of unspoken longing. It was a kiss that said everything they didn't have time to say. It was a kiss that felt like goodbye. "Take care of her," she whispered against his lips. He didn't have time to argue. The thunder of hoofbeats was right outside now, the horses almost to the porch. With one last look at her determined, terrifyingly brave face, he turned and fled out the back door, the baby clutched tight against his chest, his heart thundering louder than the gunfire he knew was about to erupt. As he disappeared into the brush, Claire stepped out onto the front porch, a rifle held loose and easy in her hand. She was alone, and she was ready. Claire's boots hit the wooden porch with a quiet, deliberate thud. The wind whipped strands of dark hair across her face, but she didn't bother to brush them away. She leveled her gaze at the 4 men dismounting in a cloud of dust, their faces half hidden by the wide brims of their hats, the steel of their rifles gleaming in the grim morning light. They didn't look surprised to see her. They looked like they'd been expecting her. The one who seemed to be the leader, a wiry man with a thick, ugly scar that snaked down the left side of his face, took off his hat and tilted his head. A smirk twisted his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice oily and unpleasant. "If it ain't the she-devil herself." Claire didn't respond. She just adjusted her grip on the rifle she held, keeping the barrel pointed at the ground. Not yet. "You didn't really think Hollis would just forget, did you?" The scarred man continued, taking a step forward. "Not after what you pulled in Cheyenne. The man damn near lost his entire legacy because of you." "I didn't take anything he didn't steal first," Claire said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Honor among thieves," another one of the men chimed in with a sneer. He had a busted lip and a hunched posture, as if every word he spoke caused him physical pain. "That's a good one. You still owe him blood for what you cost him." Claire let her breath out, slow and deliberate. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to sing in her veins, a familiar, dangerous hum. "Then come and take it," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "But I promise you, you're not walking through that door." "We ain't here for talk, lady," Scarface replied, his smirk vanishing. He gestured to his men. "We're here for you, and we'll have you, one way or another. I won't make it easy for you, she said. And for the first time, her voice cracked. Not with fear, but with the kind of profound grief that only someone who has already lost everything can truly understand. I've got nothing left to lose. But that was a lie. Somewhere behind this house, slipping through the cold brush and along the rocky stream bed, were Coulter and Maddie. The baby, her whole life ahead of her, bundled tight against the cold. The man who had just looked at her as if she were the only thing he saw in the world. She had everything to lose. And it was that thought, not the 4 gunmen or the impossible odds, that made her hand perfectly steady as she finally lifted the rifle to her shoulder. The men didn't wait for a second invitation. Gunfire erupted, splitting the fragile silence in two. The shots echoed off the distant hills like a funeral drum. Claire dove sideways off the porch, an instant before the first bullet splintered the wooden railing where her head had been. She hit the dirt hard, rolled, and came up in a crouch behind the old farm wagon, the rifle already at her shoulder. She fired twice. Fast. One of the men crumpled to his knee, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses into the dust. Another one scrambled for cover behind the water trough, bullets from her rifle chewing up the dirt at his feet. She took a mental count. 6 shots left in the magazine. Not nearly enough. She ducked as a fresh barrage of gunfire slammed into her position. Wood splinters from the wagon flew past her face, and she felt a sharp sting on her cheek. She touched it, and her fingers came away wet with blood. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Scarface, the leader, was creeping along the side of the house, his rifle held at the ready, trying to get a clear shot, trying to flank her. Claire twisted her body, angled the barrel of her rifle low beneath the wagon, and waited. She held her breath. The moment he stepped clear of the house, she pulled the trigger. He went down hard, a silent, heavy fall into the dirt. He didn't move again. 3 left, but her luck was running out just as fast as her ammunition. A bullet ricocheted off the wagon's iron wheel, sending a jagged shard of wood spinning through the air. It buried itself deep in her calf. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and scrambled backward, her legs screaming in protest. The world seemed to swim in a red haze, and then a sudden, unnerving silence. Not gunfire, not shouting, just the lonely whistle of the wind. And then footsteps. Heavy, crunching footsteps in the dirt, coming up behind her. Claire twisted around, bringing the gun up again, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird, but it wasn't one of them. It was Coulter. He had come from the direction of the barn, his own rifle slung across his chest, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. I circled back, he said, his voice a low growl. I hid Maddie in the old storm cellar behind the orchard. She's safe. He looked down at her bleeding leg, then back up at her face. You still breathing? Mostly, Claire panted, gritting her teeth against the pain. They moved together then, without words, a seamless dance of muscle memory and pure, raw instinct. He laid down covering fire as she limped, half crawling, toward the relative safety of the barn. From inside, peering through the cracks in the old wood, they could watch the last 2 of Hollis's men regrouping by the water trough. Can you walk? He asked, his voice tight with concern. I can run if I have to, she said through clenched teeth. Let's end this, now! Coulter cracked the barn door open just enough to sight his rifle. He took a steadying breath, aimed, and fired. One of the remaining men dropped like a marionette whose strings had been cut, falling face down into the mud. The last man standing hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with shock and fear. He looked from his fallen comrade to the silent barn, then back again. Then, slowly, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands high in the air. Claire and Coulter stepped out from the barn, their weapons still raised, their faces grim masks of determination. Go, Coulter said, his voice like gravel. You ride back to Hollis. You tell him she's under my roof now. You tell him if he sends more men, he better send men who are ready to die. The man looked from Claire, bloodied and limping but standing tall, to Coulter, his jaw set like stone, his eyes unblinking. He gave a single, jerky nod. Then he turned, scrambled onto his horse, and rode like hell, disappearing over the ridge. Inside the house, the adrenaline finally began to fade, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. Claire slumped into a kitchen chair, sweat slicking her brow, her wounded leg throbbing with a white-hot pain. "You should have stayed gone," she said, her voice weak. "I couldn't," he said simply, kneeling beside her to examine the wound. She let her head fall back, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. "You're a fool, Coulter Hart." "Maybe," he agreed, "but I'm your fool." He looked up at her. "You told me you were going to take care of it." "I was." "You also said you didn't have anything left to lose," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't you ever say that again." Claire's hands trembled as she started to reload her rifle, the familiar clicks of the mechanism a small comfort. "It's only going to get worse now," she whispered. "He'll send more." Coulter nodded grimly. "I know." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain that had nothing to do with her injuries. "You don't owe me any of this, Coulter. You loved Laya, and she loved you." "She loved you too," he said quietly. "Enough to ask for you when she knew she wasn't going to see another morning. Did you know that, Claire?" She blinked, her expression stunned. "What?" "The night before she passed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was barely conscious, but she grabbed my hand. She begged me. 'If something happens to me, find Claire,' she said. 'Maddie will need her. You'll need her.'" Claire's breath hitched in her throat. She said that?" Coulter nodded slowly. "She knew, Claire. I think she knew what we felt for each other. Maybe even before we were willing to admit it to ourselves. And she still wanted us to find each other. She wanted us to survive." Claire covered her face with her trembling hands, a choked sob escaping her lips. "It's not supposed to happen like this." "No," Coulter agreed, his voice gentle. "It's not, but we're still standing, and I'm not going to let Hollis or anyone else take that away from us." A sharp knock at the back door made them both freeze. Claire tried to stand too fast and cried out as a fresh wave of pain shot up her leg. Coulter motioned for her to stay put and crept silently to the door, his rifle once again in his hand. He pulled it open slowly, ready for anything. It was the man from the day before, the one who had warned them, the bounty hunter. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Standing behind him were 3 other grim-faced men, and one of them was holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. A telegram. "Got news," the scout said, his voice urgent. "And it ain't good." Coulter stepped out onto the porch. "Talk." "Hollis put a price on her head," the man said, nodding toward Claire. $500, dead or alive. He's calling in favors from every 2-bit gun for hire in 3 counties. I've already seen the posters. They're going up in Laramie, Red Rock, and all the way to Jackson. Claire, listening from the doorway, swallowed hard. "He won't stop." "No," the scout said, "but that's not the worst of it." He handed the telegram to Coulter. Coulter took the paper and read the short message. The color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What is it?" Claire asked, her voice tight with dread. He handed her the paper without a word. Her eyes scanned the black letters. The message was signed with a name she hadn't heard, hadn't dared to speak, in more than a decade. A name from a past she thought was long buried. James Alcott. Her father. A bounty hunter. A legend. A ghost. And the message contained only 6 words. 6 words that rocked her entire world. "I'm coming. Keep her safe. End." Claire's knees nearly gave out from under her. "He's alive." Coulter was there in an instant, his arm steadying her. "Who is he?" "My father," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I never told you. He disappeared when I was 17. Everyone said he was dead." "Well, he's not," Coulter said quietly, "and he's coming here." The scout who had brought the message stepped forward, his expression grim. "If James Alcott is really coming," he said, "that changes everything. Men will scatter just from hearing his name. Claire stared down at the telegram, her world spinning on its axis. She had run for so long. From the law, from her past, from the shame of who she was. And now, her past was literally riding toward her on a horse. But the question that echoed in the terrifying silence of her mind was one she couldn't answer. Was James Alcott coming to protect his daughter? Or to collect the bounty? Claire hadn't spoken her father's name aloud in nearly a decade. James Alcott. The name itself felt heavy, like a stone in her mouth. It still carried weight in the territories, a name whispered in saloons and around lonely campfires. He was once the most feared bounty hunter this side of the Mississippi, a man who moved like a shadow and never failed to bring in his mark. Then, one day, he had simply vanished. The way legends do. No explanation, no body, no goodbye, just a gaping void where a man had been. For years, Claire had carried the weight of that void, believing, in the dark and lonely corners of her heart, that it was somehow her fault. And now he was riding toward this ranch. The thought chilled her more than the $500 bounty on her head. The next 2 days passed in a haze of weary silence and grim preparation. Every snap of a twig outside, every rustle of the wind, tightened the tension in Claire's chest like a vice. The scout who'd brought the telegram, a man named Silas, stayed. So did one of his companions, a grizzled old-timer named Byron, who claimed to owe James Alcott a life debt from a card game in Dodge City years ago. They were weathered, no-nonsense men, too seasoned to waste their breath on comforting words. Their presence was both a reassurance and a threat. It meant one thing for certain. James wasn't bluffing. He was coming. And that meant others would be too. Hollis's hired guns, yes, but also others. Men who feared Alcott's name, and men who would kill to prove they didn't. Coulter worked tirelessly, his grief channeled into furious action. He reinforced the cabin, barring the windows and nailing thick planks over weak spots in the walls. He even dug up a small stash of dynamite he'd buried near the orchard the previous spring, a last resort against a threat he'd never imagined. Claire helped where she could, her movements stiff and painful, her injured leg a constant throbbing reminder of the battle that had already been fought, and the far greater one that was still to come. She hated the feeling of weakness, hated the way Coulter looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, his eyes a mixture of concern and a strange, misplaced guilt, as if he believed he should have been the one to take the bullet instead. By the third morning, the only sound that felt remotely normal was the cry of the baby. Claire was changing Maddie by the warm stove, humming a soft, half-forgotten lullaby her own mother used to sing. The baby stared up at her with wide, dark eyes, calm now, her tiny hands curled into determined fists, as if she were ready to take on the world. Claire envied that simple, uncomplicated purity. You always hum when you're nervous. Coulter was standing in the doorway, his hair still damp from washing at the well pump, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was watching her with a soft expression on his face that made her want to run and hide, and simultaneously curl into his arms and never let go. I don't hum, she said, her voice defensive. You do, he said with a small smile. You just don't hear yourself doing it. Claire pulled the blanket tighter around Maddie, avoiding his gaze. She likes it. I know she does. A long, charged beat of silence passed between them, the kind of silence that thickened the air and made it hard to breathe. She looks so much like her, Claire said finally, her voice low. Every day a little more, Coulter replied. But there's something of you in her eyes, too. A kind of strength. Claire turned away abruptly. Don't say that. Why not? Because I don't want to be what she remembers, she said, her voice laced with a bitter self-loathing. I don't want her growing up knowing who I am, what I've done. She deserves better. Coulter crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt beside the rocker. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a warm, solid thing beside her. You came back here, and you saved her life, Claire. You gave me my life back too. I don't give a damn what came before that." Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. She just held the baby a little closer, letting the warmth of Coulter's nearness soak through the fear that was creeping around her ribs like frost. They ate their dinner that night in near silence, the tension in the small cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. Byron, the old-timer, stood watch outside, his hulking silhouette framed in the dying light of the sunset. Silas and the others had ridden out to scout the surrounding territory, promising to return by dawn. Claire was clearing the dishes, scrubbing the last tin plate with a fierce energy, when a knock froze her mid-motion. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't the demanding rap of a lawman. It was a single, deliberate, almost casual knock on the front door. Every man in the house rose in silent, perfect unison. Coulter motioned for Claire to get back. She moved toward the staircase, clutching Maddie to her chest, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Coulter opened the door, and there he was, James Alcott. The years had not been kind to him, but they hadn't softened him either. His beard was shot through with gray, and the lines on his face were carved deeper than Claire remembered, a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. But his eyes were exactly the same. A hard steel blue, as sharp and cold as a drawn blade. He wore a long duster slick with trail dust, a rifle slung across his back, and a pistol holstered on each hip. He looked like a man who had never stopped riding, a man who had been at war with the world for so long he'd forgotten what peace felt like. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Claire felt like a little girl again, standing on the porch steps, waiting for him to come home from a long ride, wondering if this would be the time he would smile at her, wondering why he never did. Alcott's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail, every person, every weapon. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't step inside. He just tilted his head once, his eyes finally landing on her. Claire. The single word was not a question, but a statement. A summons. She stepped out from the shadows of the staircase, the sleeping baby still cradled in her arms. "Pa," she whispered, the word feeling strange and fragile. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfight. It was a silence filled with a decade of unanswered questions, of resentment, of a daughter's pain, and a father's abandonment. Alcott's gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms. "Yours?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Claire nodded. He frowned, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Didn't think you'd be the one to settle down." "I'm not," she said, a spark of her old defiance flaring up. That got the smallest, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, too stubborn to follow any man's lead." "I didn't follow anyone," she said, her voice sharp. "I made my own way." "Good," he grunted. Coulter stepped forward then, placing himself slightly in front of Claire, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by her father. "Mr. Alcott," he said, his voice steady. Alcott's cold eyes cut to him. "So you must be the cowboy," he said, his tone dismissive. "The one who thinks he can keep her safe." Coulter didn't flinch. "I'll die trying." "You might," Alcott said flatly. "He's not the enemy here," Claire said, stepping between them, her patience wearing thin. "No," Alcott agreed, his gaze shifting to the dark windows. "But there are a few dozen men out there who are, and they're coming." "We know," Claire said. "We've seen the posters." "You haven't seen the men," he shot back. "I have. I passed them on the ridge not 2 hours ago. Hollis didn't just hire a few ranch hands. He hired the Quinn brothers. He hired Braden Callis. He even dug up Red Donnelly from whatever hole he'd crawled into." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Those weren't just names. They were legends of a different sort. Killers, men who left trails of bodies behind them. "They'll come hard, and they'll come tonight," Alcott continued, his voice grim. That storm building on the horizon? That's their cover. By morning, this place will be nothing but ash, unless we dig in and make a stand. Coulter motioned toward the reinforced windows. We've fortified what we can. It's not enough, Alcott said bluntly. He turned and gave a sharp whistle into the darkness. A moment later, 3 more men rode into the small yard, their horses dark shapes against the dying light. They were a hard-looking crew. One was missing an eye, a jagged scar where it used to be. Another walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a crutch, strapped to his saddle. The last was barely more than a kid, no older than 17. But the sawed-off shotgun he carried looked like it had seen more than its fair share of fights. Old debts, Alcott said simply, by way of explanation. Men who remember what this family was, what she is. His steel-blue eyes met Claire's. I'm not you, she said, her voice a low whisper. No, Alcott agreed, a strange, almost sad look on his face. You're better. But blood doesn't care what you want, girl. It only knows what you are. As the last sliver of sun disappeared beneath a wall of black, angry-looking clouds, they made ready. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and impending violence. Coulter, guided by Alcott, planted the dynamite charges along the north fence line. Byron and the one-eyed man laid a series of wicked-looking traps across the main path to the house. The young kid, Rafe, took up a position on the high ground of the hayloft with a scoped rifle. Claire stayed inside with Maddie, her heart beating a frantic rhythm that matched the creak of leather, the whisper of drawn blades, and the hushed, final prayers of men who knew they might not see the dawn. She had walked side by side with death more times than she could count. But this was different. This time, the price of failure was not just her own life. It was Coulter's. It was Maddie's. It was everything. Maddie stirred in her arms, sensing the change in the air, the tension that was as palpable as the coming storm. Claire rocked her gently, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. You'll grow up free, she murmured into the baby's soft hair. You'll be safe. I swear it on my life. A brilliant fork of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the yard for a split second. The thunder that followed was a low, guttural roar. The storm was here, and with it came the riders. They came like phantoms out of the rain-swept darkness, dark shapes on dark horses. At first, it was just the sound of hoofbeats, a rhythmic drumming that grew louder and louder. Then came the voices, taunting and jeering, calling out names Claire hadn't used since she was a lost and lonely 16-year-old girl. Alcott stood in the middle of the yard, a shotgun resting casually over his shoulder, as if he were welcoming old friends to a Sunday social. The riders stopped just out of rifle range, a line of menacing silhouettes. One man, Braden Callis by the look of him, stepped forward. He was holding something small and shiny in his hand. He tossed it into the mud at Alcott's feet. A locket, Leia's locket, one Claire had given her years ago. A trade, Alcott! Callis yelled over the wind. The girl for your legacy. Give us Claire, and we ride out of here. No one else has to get hurt. Alcott didn't even glance at the locket. He just spat into the dirt. Try and take her. Callis smiled, a flash of white teeth in the darkness. Your call, old man. The sky cracked open, not with lightning, but with a sudden, deafening volley of gunfire. It came from all sides at once. It was an ambush, a siege, and then the world exploded. A blast from the north fence ripped through the night as Coulter detonated the first of the dynamite charges. Rifles barked from the hayloft. Fire suddenly lit up the trees to the east. The house itself came under a withering assault. Bullets tore through the walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Claire ducked low, shielding Maddie with her own body. Coulter's aunt, a stern woman named Elspeth, who'd arrived just hours before in a panic, grabbed the baby from her. Go! She yelled. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She snatched up her rifle. No! Coulter shouted from the doorway. Stay down! But it was too late. A primal rage, hot and cleansing, had burned away all her fear. She flung open the front door and ran headlong into the storm. The yard was a scene from hell. Alcott was down on one knee, blood seeping from a wound in his side, but he was still firing his shotgun into the darkness. Byron lay motionless near the porch steps. Rafe, the young boy, was out of ammunition and was swinging his empty shotgun like a desperate club. Coulter had 2 men on him, grappling in the mud, and he was losing ground. Claire let out a raw, guttural scream, a sound of pure, undiluted fury. The Quinn brother closest to her turned, his eyes wide with surprise. She shot him square in the chest. He went down without a sound. Another man rushed her, his face a twisted mask of hate. She didn't have time to chamber another round. She reversed the rifle and drove the steel butt plate into his face with all her strength. He crumpled. Fire, smoke, rain, mud, the screams of dying men. It was every nightmare she had ever run from, now made real, now staring her in the face. And through the deafening roar of the battle, one single, solitary truth rose above the chaos. She would not die tonight. She would not die on her knees. Not for her past, not for Hollis, not for anyone. They would talk about that night for years to come in the saloons and general stores of Wyoming. They would call it the Storm of the Heart Ranch. They'd say a ghost rode in on a bolt of lightning and left a trail of blood in his wake. They'd tell stories of James Alcott's daughter, the one they had all mocked and cast aside, standing like a vengeful goddess in the heart of the fire. But in that moment, there were no legends. There was only mud and pain and the ragged, desperate breath between one heartbeat and the next. Claire didn't aim when she chambered another round and pulled the trigger. She didn't have to. The shot slammed into the chest of the man who was grappling with Coulter, sending him tumbling backward into the muck with a wet, gurgling sound. Coulter scrambled to his feet, giving her a single wild-eyed nod of thanks before he turned and tackled another attacker, the 2 of them disappearing into the storm-lashed darkness. Claire spun back toward the porch, just as the younger Quinn brother, a mountain of a man with dead eyes, barreled into her. The impact slammed her against the cabin wall so hard her teeth clacked together, and the rifle was knocked from her grasp, landing in the wet grass. He snarled something incoherent, his breath hot and foul on her face, and raised a long, wicked-looking knife. She didn't hesitate. She drove her knee up into his groin with all her might. As he doubled over with a grunt of pain, she twisted free and snatched the heavy shotgun from Byron's fallen hand. The blast at point-blank range was deafening. It blew the man backward, his body arcing through the air like a broken marionette before he landed in a heap. Claire stood over him for a long, shuddering moment, her chest heaving, rain soaking her hair and plastering it to her face. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the roaring surge of adrenaline and the deafening truth that was screaming in her ears. She was still alive. And she wasn't done yet. Behind her, the barn suddenly lit up in a fiery orange flash. Coulter had detonated another one of his traps. The explosion was followed by screams and then a sudden, chilling silence. Alcott staggered toward her out of the smoke, his hand clutched tight to his bleeding side. He didn't speak. He just gave her a single, sharp nod of approval. It was more than she'd gotten from him in her entire life, and in that moment, it was all she needed. They moved together then, a father and daughter united in violence, sweeping toward the smoldering barn where the last of Hollis's men had taken cover. Claire paused by the fence, pulled the small, reliable revolver from the holster strapped to her ankle, and passed Alcott a fresh clip for his Winchester rifle. Not a word was exchanged between them. There was no need. Inside the barn, the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood mixed with the familiar scent of wet hay. One of the attackers lay dead in the center of the floor. Rafe had gotten him, though the boy now sat slumped in a corner, his face pale, a makeshift tourniquet cinched tight around his upper arm with a leather belt. Coulter leaned against the back wall, breathing heavily, his coat peppered with bullet holes that had miraculously missed him. Claire leveled her pistol, her eyes scanning the shadows. "How many left?" "2," Coulter panted. "Callis and Red Donnelly. They slipped past during the first wave. They're in the south field, probably trying to regroup and circle back around. Alcott grunted, wincing as he leaned against a support beam. They won't get the chance. He turned to Claire, his expression grim. You stay here. Guard the boy and the others. But Claire just shook her head, her jaw set in a stubborn line he knew all too well. I'm not a child anymore, Pa, and you're bleeding. Alcott gave her a hard, flinty stare, as if he might argue. But then, something shifted in his cold blue eyes. It wasn't a softening, not exactly, but a kind of grudging acceptance. It was the look a man gives when he finally realizes the world has changed, and he is no longer the one in charge of it. Then you ride with me, he said, his voice a low rasp. And they did. They rode out into the dying storm, just the two of them, father and daughter, past and present. A ghost and his legacy, colliding in the rain-soaked fields beneath a bruised and battered sky. Claire kept low in her saddle, her fingers steady on the reins, her pistol held ready. Alcott, despite his wound, rode as if he hadn't aged a day, his dark silhouette slicing through the downpour like a blade. They found Callis and Donnelly crouched behind a lightning-scarred, dead tree, frantically trying to reload their weapons. Claire didn't wait for an order. She didn't hesitate. She fired first. The bullet caught Donnelly in the thigh, and he went down with a high-pitched scream. Callis spun and returned fire, a wild shot that clipped Claire's shoulder, sending a searing jolt of pain down her arm. She dropped low against her horse's neck, gritting her teeth, the warm slickness of her own blood mixing with the cold rain. Alcott dismounted with a fluid grace that defied his age and his injury. He circled wide, a phantom in the gray light, and flanked them from behind. It was over in seconds. Claire stood over the wounded Braden Callis, her own shoulder throbbing, her pistol aimed squarely at his head. He spat a wad of bloody phlegm at her boot. Should have killed you years ago, he snarled. Back when you were nothing but a fat, worthless girl nobody wanted. She didn't blink. The girl he was talking about was long dead. Maybe, she said, her voice eerily calm. But worthless? She pulled the trigger. Callis slumped to the ground. Red Donnelly was whimpering nearby, clutching his shattered leg. Claire turned to Alcott, who was now leaning heavily against the dead tree. We take him back. We make him talk. Alcott looked at the writhing, pathetic man in the mud. Leave him for the crows, he growled. But Claire didn't move. He'll just come back. Then you know what to do. Claire's hand tightened on the grip of her revolver, but she didn't shoot. She let her arm drop to her side. Let him crawl, she whispered, her voice like ice. Let him crawl all the way back to whatever rock he slithered out from under. Let him tell the others what happened here tonight. Alcott met her gaze, a long, searching look. Then, for the second time that night, he nodded. And they left him there. A broken message for Jed Hollis and anyone else who dared to come after them. Dawn broke slowly, a smear of bloody red bleeding into the gray sky. Smoke rose in a thin, lazy spiral from the smoldering remains of the barn. The cabin's east wall was scorched black, but it was still standing. Byron was dead. Rafe and the one-eyed man were wounded but alive. The rest of Alcott's crew had scattered back into the hills from whence they came, and Coulter stood at the front gate, battered, bruised, and bloodied, but waiting. Claire slid off her horse and limped toward him. He didn't speak. He just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to fuse them together. He held her as if he would never let her go. I thought, he began, his voice choked with emotion. I know, she whispered, burying her face in his chest, the smell of wood smoke and rain, and him filling her senses. And finally, after all the years of running, of fighting, of holding it all in, she let herself cry. Behind them, Alcott leaned against a fence post, watching them, his face an unreadable mask. Storms pass, he said after a long while. Claire pulled away from Coulter and turned to face him. You're leaving? Have to, he said, pushing himself off the post. Men like me, We don't get to stay. We just pass through. You could, she said, her voice pleading. You could stay. Alcott shook his head, a sad, final gesture. Don't ask me to be something I never was, Claire. You've built something good here, something worth keeping. I'd only bring more trouble to your door. She stepped closer to him, rain still dripping from the ends of her dark hair. I used to lie awake at night and dream about you coming back, she confessed. He nodded, a flicker of pain in his own eyes. I know. I used to dream about staying. They stood there for a long moment, the heavy weight of unspoken words and lost years hanging between them. Then Alcott reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her in a decade. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice a low rasp. More than I ever said. More than I ever knew how to say. Claire swallowed the thick lump in her throat. Is that all I get? For the first time she could ever remember, a genuine wry smirk touched his lips. That, and this. He reached into the inner pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, heavy, leather-bound pouch. He pressed it into her hand. Inside were not coins but names, accounts, a meticulously kept ledger of bounties, payoffs, and criminal dealings. I spent my life hunting scum, he said. This is a record of all of it. You'll need to know who to watch out for, where to find them if they ever decide to come back for you. This world doesn't forgive easily, Claire, but it does respect power. She clutched the heavy pouch in her hand. I don't want to be feared. Too late, he said, the smirk widening into a grin. You already are. And with that, James Alcott turned, mounted his horse with a weary grace, and rode off into the bloody sunrise, not once looking back. Claire watched him until he was just a small dot on the horizon, knowing, with a deep and aching certainty, that she would likely never see him again. But for the first time in her life, something inside her felt settled. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was strength. Beside her, Coulter gently touched her arm. You still think you're not worth something? She didn't answer with words. She just turned, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him, long and deep and full of promise. Later that morning, as they were surveying the damage, the townspeople started to arrive. They had seen the smoke, heard the distant gunfire, and the rumors were already flying. Most of them were the same people who had written Claire off from the start, who had mocked her sighs, whispered about her past, and sneered at her silence. But when they found her there, standing tall amidst the wreckage of the battle, with dried blood on her hands and a sleeping baby held safe in her arms, they looked at her differently. They looked at her with a new, grudging respect. They looked at her with fear. A few stayed. They brought food and tools and offers to help rebuild. And Claire, to Coulter's surprise, let them. Because she had learned something important in the fire and the rain. Strength didn't come from closing yourself off from the world. It came from standing tall with all your scars visible, daring the world to judge you, and daring yourself to keep going no matter what. That night, she sat on the newly repaired porch with Maddie asleep on her lap and Coulter sitting beside her. The stars had come out, bright and clear in the clean-washed sky. She'll ask about all this one day, Coulter said quietly. She'll want to know where she comes from. Claire looked down at the baby's peaceful face and rocked her gently. Then I'll tell her the truth. All of it? Claire nodded, a small, determined smile on her lips. Especially the part where they all said I wasn't good enough, and the part where I proved every single one of them wrong. Coulter smiled back at her. That's a story she deserves to hear. Claire looked down at Maddie, then out at the dark, silent plains that stretched before them. So do I, she whispered. The rebuilding came in pieces, the way most things worth keeping do. They started with the cabin's scorched wall, stripping it down to the blackened frame and rebuilding it plank by painful plank. Timber was dragged in from the woods by hand, and the rhythmic sound of their hammers became the new heartbeat of the ranch. Coulter's shoulder was still stiff and bruised, but he worked beside her from sunup to sundown, the silence between them comfortable and steady. Claire did more than her share of the work. She always had, But something in her had shifted. She no longer moved with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove her worth. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew it. The same neighbors who had once avoided her now came by in wagons, bringing nails and jars of canned goods and awkward, unspoken apologies. One woman, a Mrs. Calhoun, who had once loudly called Claire an ox in a skirt at the general store, showed up with 2 fresh-baked apple pies and a box of her husband's best tools. "You just let me know if you need anything else," she muttered, her eyes fixed firmly on the tips of her dusty shoes. The old Claire might have told her exactly where to shove the pies. She might have reminded the woman of the cruel laughter, the pointed fingers, the venomous gossip. But the new Claire, the one forged in fire, simply took the basket and nodded. "Thank you, Mary." Some battles, she was learning, weren't worth reigniting. Others, however, were just getting started. Sheriff Holder rode in 2 days later, not alone, but with a posse of 4 deputies. He found Claire in the yard, sleeves rolled up, her hands raw from hammering. He dismounted slowly, holding his hat in his hands, looking for all the world like a man approaching a grizzly bear's den. "Miss Alcott," he began, his voice hesitant. She stopped her work, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, and met his eyes without blinking. "Sheriff, we heard about what happened," he stammered. "About the attack, about your father." He cleared his throat. "You here to arrest me?" she asked, her voice flat. He looked startled, then shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am. Hell, truth be told, most folks in town are saying you did us all a favor. Those men Hollis hired, they were nothing but trouble waiting to happen. And Hollis himself has been on my list for 5 years. He took a deep breath. "I came to tell you that the governor's office is offering a bounty for any information leading to the capture of Quinn's remaining riders. And, for what it's worth, some of us were wrong about you." Claire stared at him for a long, uncomfortable beat, then turned back to the wall she'd been fixing. "You should tell them that, not me." The sheriff shifted awkwardly on his feet. "Well, if you happen to find anything useful in your father's things, let me know." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. Coulter walked up behind her, handing her a fresh nail from his pouch. "You going to help him?" "I don't owe this town a thing," she said, hammering the nail home with a single powerful blow. "No," Coulter agreed quietly, "but maybe this isn't about what you owe. Maybe it's about who you are." Claire didn't answer. That night, long after Coulter and Maddie had gone to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table by the light of a single lantern, her father's heavy ledger open before her. The handwriting inside was jagged and rushed, sometimes barely legible, but the detail was astonishing. Every name, every date, every back-alley deal was accounted for. It was a roadmap of the entire territory's criminal underworld. She found bounties that spanned from Wyoming to the Kansas border, records of payments made to corrupt lawmen, and notes on powerful men who had escaped justice because they had the right friends in the wrong places. And then she found something else. Tucked into a hidden pocket in the back of the ledger was a single letter, sealed with wax, the envelope addressed with one word: Claire. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if I'm gone, it means I was right all along. You are stronger than I ever was. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I wasn't a good father. Hell, most days I wasn't even a decent man. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. I thought it was better for you not to know the man I had become. But I never stopped watching. Not really. I always kept tabs from a distance. I saw you fall, and I saw you get back up. I saw you fall again, and I saw you still rise. You carry more weight on your shoulders than any bullet I ever dodged. They mocked you for your size, for your strength, because it was the only thing their small minds could see. They never bothered to look deeper. They never saw the steel in your spine. But I did. I always did. I hope one day you'll understand why I did what I did. Maybe you'll even forgive me. Or maybe not. Either way, know this. I was always proud of you. James Alcott Claire read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a film of tears she refused to let fall. She didn't cry, not right then. But when the lantern finally burned out and the first hint of dawn was breaking, she lay down beside Maddie's crib and held the sleeping child tight, whispering her father's name just once, like a final, difficult prayer. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Spring came early that year, chasing the last of the snow from the high peaks and bringing with it a fresh wave of whispers. A rider came through town claiming to have seen 3 of Hollis Quinn's surviving men heading west, looting small, isolated farms along the way. Another said they were holed up in the hills near Crow Ridge, regrouping. A third told a wilder story, of a woman, heavy-set and scarred, with eyes like cold steel, hunting them one by one with nothing but a revolver and a satchel full of names. Claire listened to each story without confirming or denying a thing. But that night, she cleaned and oiled her revolver. One morning, just before dawn, she saddled the strong bay mare Coulter had been raising. She left a note on the kitchen table. Gone for a few days, maybe more. Don't follow me. Claire. She took only what she needed: a rope, dried meat, a canteen of water, extra ammunition, and the letter from her father. She didn't expect to find them so soon. But fate, it seems, has a way of honoring vengeance when it walks with such a clear purpose. She tracked the first one, a man named Grady Wills, to an abandoned mining shaft 3 hours south of the ranch. He recognized her too late. He tried to plead, tried to bargain, claimed he'd had no real part in the attack on the ranch. She didn't shoot him, not at first. She asked him who planned it, who ordered it, who was the one who sent the message that Claire Alcott was weak, an easy target, ripe for humiliation. It was Hollis, he blubbered. It was all Hollis Quinn. Try again, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He hesitated, his eyes wide with terror, and then he gave her a name. It wasn't Quinn. It was someone else. Someone powerful, someone still in town. Claire shot him through the knee, left him tied up by the entrance to the shaft for the sheriff to find, and rode for home as fast as the bay mare could carry her. Coulter met her on the trail, just as she was cresting the ridge that overlooked their valley. He didn't yell. He didn't question her. He just turned his horse and rode beside her in a grim, knowing silence until they reached the cabin. The yard was quiet. Too quiet. The cabin looked untouched, but something was wrong. The barn door was slightly ajar, and Maddie's cradle, which always sat on the porch in the warm afternoon sun, was empty. Claire's blood ran cold. A sound came from inside the house. A low, deliberate scrape of a chair. They drew their guns and moved as one, silent as ghosts, toward the front door. Inside the kitchen stood a man Claire didn't recognize. He was short and clean-cut, and wore a suit that was far too polished for these parts. He had a badge pinned to his vest, but it wasn't the local sheriff's star. Behind him, on the floor, Maddie was sitting in a wicker basket crying. "Don't," Claire warned, her voice a low growl, her revolver aimed at the center of his chest. The man raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "I'm not here to hurt her," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Or you." "Then why in the hell are you in my house with my daughter?" Coulter demanded, stepping up beside Claire. "My name is Eli Vance," the man said. "I'm a territorial marshal out of Santa Fe. We've been tracking James Alcott's operations for the past 3 years." "He's dead," Coulter said bluntly. "I know," Marshal Vance said, "but his ledger isn't." Claire's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Vance's gaze flickered to the leather pouch tied to her saddlebag, the one containing her father's ledger. "That book you're carrying has the names of judges, landowners, even other marshals who are on the take. Your father wasn't just a bounty hunter, Miss Alcott. He was a meticulous record keeper. And the book he left behind, it contains enough evidence to gut half the power structure in this entire territory." Claire didn't flinch. Good, she said. Not good for the powerful people he was documenting, Vance countered. Which means you and that baby are in more danger than you can possibly imagine. Coulter swore under his breath. Is that a threat? It's a warning, the marshal said. They know you have the book. They will stop at nothing to get it back. He looked directly at Claire, his eyes serious. So you have a choice. You can run for the rest of your life, always looking over your shoulder, or you can help us burn the whole rotten structure to the ground. Claire's jaw tightened. She looked at Coulter, then at Maddie crying in the basket, then back at the calm, determined face of the marshal, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Where do we start? She asked. Marshal Vance smiled back. That's what I was hoping you'd say. By nightfall, the plans were made. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Claire would ride with Marshal Vance to Santa Fe. She would deliver the ledger directly to the territorial governor and testify, if needed, against the men named within its pages. Coulter would take Maddie and disappear, heading north to a remote cabin owned by his family until it was all over. It was the only way to keep them safe. They all knew the risks. They all knew there was no other way. As she packed a small bag, Coulter came and stood beside her, his face a mask of worry. You don't have to do this, Claire. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I do. He nodded, knowing it was useless to argue. He pulled her into his arms. Just come back to us. Claire pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes for a moment. I will, she whispered. She rode out at dawn, Marshal Vance and 2 of his deputies beside her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Behind her, her past smoldered in the ashes of the burned-out barn. Ahead of her, across the wide and dangerous plains, the reckoning waited. Santa Fe was a city built on polished boots and polished lies. It was louder and dirtier than Claire remembered, a place where power smiled at you in public while sharpening a knife behind its back. She didn't trust any of it. Not the grand sandstone courthouses with their hollow promises of justice, and not the whispers that slithered from shadowed doorways as she passed. She didn't even fully trust Marshal Eli Vance, who sat beside her in the carriage, the weight of her father's ledger resting on the seat between them like a ticking bomb. He was a quiet man, too calm for her liking. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and didn't flinch when she'd bluntly asked him how many of the names in that book were men he knew. 6, he'd said without hesitation. 3 judges, 2 wealthy land barons, and 1 sheriff, and that's just from the first 30 pages. Claire didn't ask what page her father had died on. She had a feeling she already knew. It wasn't the last one. The courthouse was a looming brick giant that smelled of old paper, stale sweat, and the ghosts of long-buried verdicts. They sat her at a polished oak table in a secure room with 2 stern-faced men in federal coats sitting across from her. Their fingers were steepled in front of them like clergymen ready to receive a final confession. She told them everything. She told them what her father had kept, what he had written, and what he had died for. When she finished, the older of the 2 men leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. Do you fully comprehend the weight of what you are bringing to us, Miss Alcott? Yeah, she said, her voice laced with a weary cynicism. The question is, do you? Because she knew what power did when it felt cornered. She had the burn scars on the cabin, the bloodstains on her boots, and the nightmares of screaming men to prove it. She'd seen it laugh in her face when she walked into a saloon, and she'd seen it cower when she stood back up. They gave her a small, sparse room at the back of the marshal's office to stay in while they painstakingly copied the ledger, page by damning page. Armed guards were posted outside her door around the clock, but Claire didn't sleep. She just stared out the barred window at the sliver of moon and thought of Coulter, miles away, reading stories to Maddie by a lonely campfire. She thought of her father's letter, and she thought of what would come next, when this ledger was no longer just ink on paper, but a weapon of war. Because war was coming. She could feel it in the way the sky pressed low over the city, in the way every door creaked like it was holding its breath, in the way men on the street flinched and looked away when she passed. 3 days in, Vance came to her room, his face grim. "We have a leak," he said without preamble. "Someone on the inside tipped off the Marquez estate. Their family name is all over your father's notes. They'll be coming, for the book and for you." Claire didn't ask if he had a plan to run. She just stood up. Then let them come. But it wasn't the Marquez family's hired guns who found her first. It was Wren. Claire was washing her face in a porcelain basin, the steam from the hot water curling around her, when the knock came. It was soft, almost tentative, a sound so out of place in this world of slammed doors and cocked hammers that it put her instantly on edge. Her hand went to the pistol she kept tucked in her waistband. She opened the door, and her breath caught in her throat. Wren stepped into the room as if she'd never been gone, her jet-black hair tied back in a practical knot, a rifle slung casually over one shoulder. Her coat was torn at the sleeve, there was a crust of dried blood on her cheek, and her eyes held the same kind of storm that Claire recognized in the mirror every morning. "You're alive," Claire whispered, stunned. "So are you," Wren said, her voice dry. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Finally, Wren spoke again. "You think you're the only one who kept fighting after Hollis?" "I didn't think anything," Claire said honestly. "I thought you were dead. Most people do. Most people think I should be." Wren's gaze drifted to the ledger sitting on the table. "I'm here because I heard what you were doing, and I figured you were going to need someone who can shoot straight when the walls finally cave in." Claire tried not to show the overwhelming wave of relief that washed over her. "This isn't just about me anymore, Wren." "I know," Wren said, stepping further into the room. "But it started with you, and I still have some debts to pay." Claire stared at her old friend for a long time, then gave a single sharp nod. They didn't have to wait long for the walls to cave in. That night, the city exploded. It started with a fire at the Western Stables, a diversion to draw out the local law. Then came the gunshots, then the screams. Vance burst through the door to Claire's room, a smear of blood on his shirt, 2 of his deputies dragging a wounded man behind them. "They're here," he gasped. Wren was already lacing up her boots. Claire grabbed the original ledger and her revolver. "We can still get you out," Vance said, his eyes wild. "We can get you on a train to Kansas." "I'm not running," Claire said, her voice like stone. "You don't understand," he insisted. "These aren't just a few hired guns. They've hired professional assassins. This has become political now. There's big money behind this." "I said," Claire repeated, her voice dropping to a low, deadly register, "I'm not running." Wren loaded a shell into her rifle with a satisfying shuck-shuck. And she's not alone. The next hour unraveled like a tightening noose. The courthouse itself was set on fire. The telegraph lines were cut, plunging the city into an isolated darkness. Men with scarves covering their faces and carrying expensive, polished rifles took up positions on the rooftops. Claire counted at least 10 of them. She didn't have 10 bullets. They barricaded themselves inside the marshal's office, moving the ledger into the steel-lined vault room. Vance stationed his remaining men at the windows, but Claire could see the raw fear in their eyes. These were paper pushers, men used to serving warrants and signing documents, not fighting a full-blown siege. Claire stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding a steady, hard rhythm against her ribs. Then a voice rang out from the street outside, amplified by a bullhorn, a voice of cold, arrogant steel. "Claire Alcott, daughter of the Hound, you have something that belongs to us. Walk out now, with the book, and we will let the child live." The breath left Claire's body in a painful rush. "Maddie." Wren turned, her eyes wide with shock. "They found Coulter." "No!" Claire's voice cracked. "He was supposed to be gone, miles away from here." "They must have tracked him," Vance swore, grabbing a map off the wall. "They used the heat on you to flush him out." He stabbed a finger at the map. "We've got one chance. If we can get through the old drainage tunnels, we can flank their left side and maybe—" but Claire was already moving toward the door. "Where are you going?" Vance yelled. She stopped at the door, her hand on the knob, her back to him. "To get my daughter." Vance grabbed her arm. "It's a trap, Claire. You know it is. Then I'm walking straight into it." She was out the door before he could stop her. Wren was right behind her. They found the camp just outside of town, past a dry arroyo where the rocks rose up from the desert floor like cracked, broken teeth. There were 6 men, their tents half collapsed from the wind, a wagon hidden beneath a dusty canvas, and Maddie was there. She was crying, tied with a rough rope to a wooden post, her small face red with rage and fear. Coulter was on his knees beside her, his face bloodied and swollen, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The man in charge stood tall and confident, with gold buttons down his tailored vest and a rifle slung casually over his chest. He smiled when Claire stepped out of the rocks and into the flickering firelight. "I was wondering if you'd have the courage to come," he said. "I always come," she said, her voice flat. Without a word, Wren peeled off to the left, melting into the deep shadows of the rocks like a ghost. Claire kept walking forward, into the light. "You know," the man continued, his smile widening, "your father once told me I didn't have the guts to pull off a real operation. I guess the old man was wrong about that, too." Claire didn't answer. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Coulter's head. "Drop your weapon." Claire tossed her revolver into the dirt. "You want the book?" "Of course I do." She held up the heavy leather pouch she was carrying. "The decoy." "Here," she said. He took a step forward, his eyes greedy, his hand reaching for it, and then Wren shot him in the leg. All hell broke loose. Claire dove for Maddie, slicing through the ropes with a knife she'd pulled from her boot. Coulter, with a roar of pure fury, headbutted the man standing over him, knocking him unconscious. Gunfire erupted from the rocks as Wren began to pick off the remaining men with a deadly, methodical precision. Claire grabbed Maddie, clutched her tight, and ran for the darkness. Behind her the world screamed. And then it fell silent. By morning, 6 more men were dead. Vance and his deputies met them at the town gate. They placed the real ledger, safe and untouched, on his desk. Later that day, they burned the decoy in a rusty barrel behind the office, for good measure. Claire stayed only long enough to give her final official statement. Then she, Coulter, a newly deputized Wren, and Maddie rode for home. They rebuilt the cabin again, stronger this time. They planted wildflowers in the ashes of the old barn. Wren took over a neighboring abandoned shack and spent her days teaching Maddie how to climb trees and teaching Claire, slowly but surely, how to smile again. Coulter held her every night, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the dark. And Claire, the girl who had once bent and nearly broken under the weight of every cruel whisper, every mocking laugh, every hateful sneer, now stood tall in a town that no longer dared to misjudge her. Because now they all knew who she was. They knew what she was capable of. She wasn't just the daughter of a feared man anymore. She was the woman who had finished what he started. And in doing so, had started something far greater, all on her own. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next.